Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the conference. This morning, we have a panel on populism in Southeast Asia and Turkey. My name is Anna Crowe. I'm a clinical instructor and lecturer here at the Human Rights Program, and I'll be moderating this panel. To introduce our panelists, to my right is Yee Htun, who is a clinical instructor, also here at the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School. She's a Burmese-Canadian lawyer and an expert on Myanmar who has long advocated for democracy and human rights in that country. To her right is Richard Heydarian, who is a Manila-based academic, a columnist, and an author. And his most recent book is actually called The Rise of Duterte, A Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy. So a very appropriate topic for us here today. And finally, to Richard's right is Jamie O'Donnell. Jamie teaches and writes on political and legal development, and he is currently a senior fellow at the Miller Institute for Global Challenges and the Law at UC Berkeley School of Law, as well as a lecturer in residence. So the panelists will be speaking for 15 minutes each, and then they will have an opportunity to comment on each other's presentations before we open up the floor to questions. So I'll ask Yee to start us off today.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Good morning, and thank you, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to speak today about the dangerous wave of populism that's been sweeping in my country of birth, Myanmar, or Burma, as it's also known, and also the role in which exclusionary identity politics have played in bringing about the Rohingya crisis. It's hard to imagine, but in case those of you who are not aware of what's been happening, but it's that over 500,000 of Rohingyas have had to flee Myanmar since to the neighboring country of Bangladesh since August 2017. The military claims that it is conducting a clearance operation against Rohingya insurgents after 30 of its police posts were attacked. But the Rohingya refugee survivors, they tell a different story. They have spoken out about indiscriminate targeting against civilians, killing by security forces, villages being burned and razed, and the use of rape and sexual violence against women and girls. The Rohingya crisis is also the fastest growing refugee crisis in the world, and it has been described by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Certain commentators would argue that Myanmar's democratization unleashed deep-seated tensions within the communities, which has led to this virulent form of nationalism. I personally would disagree with this analysis. I would cover in this presentation really of how the legacy of Myanmar's colonialism under the British rule and half a century of the military isolationism has laid this foundation around this toxic narrative of others, which have sought to weaken the Burmese state, namely for its Buddhist Burman majority. Secondly, I want to look at the conditions which have, from both inside Myanmar and outside Myanmar, which have really led to this, allowed this spread of hate and intolerance throughout the country. So given the dangers of populism and the threat that it posed not just to the persecuted religious and ethnic minorities, but to the future of democracy and human rights in the country, I want to end my presentation on what we can do domestically in Myanmar and also as an international community to respond to it. So I'll kick off things by talking about the historical context. So Myanmar is a diverse place. It borders China, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, and Laos. It is home to hundreds of multi-ethnic groups practicing different faiths, and they've managed to coexist it for a period of time. It was colonized in Britain for the latter part of the 19th century, and it remained under a British colony until 1948. And Myanmar at one point became a province of India, and the British encouraged immigration from the subcontinent to help administer this colonial state. I bring up the Myanmar's colonial past because the identity of who belongs to Myanmar and often hinges on this time of this pre-colonial and colonial era. And the ultranationalists and the military junta would claim that the the 1982 Citizenship Act, which recognizes only 135 ethnic nationalities in Myanmar, are groups that predate colonialism. So because of this arbitrary, connotation, they have determined that the Rohingyas, for instance, are not native to Myanmar. They were people that they deemed were brought over to administer by the British. This, of course, is a false narrative, because in some ways the borders and how the flow of human traffic were not so clear-cut, or that it doesn't recognize those things. So talking about Myanmar under British colonializing, there was the colonizers really employed this divide and rule policy, where you've got this strategy of creating divisions amongst the different ethnic individuals, which really weakened the opposition and consolidated control for the British colonials. And the Burman majority, which was, disfranchised by the British colonials, both politically, economically, and very importantly, religiously. The country gained independence in 1948, and the newly formed government, led by Aung San, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's father, a national hero, he strived to a certain degree and managed in some ways to sort of rebuild trust among different ethnic groups. There was a famous agreement called the Finland Agreement, where the centralized Burman government agreed that, we would grant autonomy and self-determination in exchange for building off this new independent nation together. However, his vision for a federal democratic nation, and really for Myanmar, democracy died when he was assassinated. And after his assassination, a coup in 1962 installed a brutal military dictatorship in its place. It ruled with an iron fist. It mercilessly targeted anyone and everyone, not discriminating on religious or ethnic lines, who dare challenge its power. And because of that, a lot of the ethnic and religious minorities who had been promised self-autonomy and determination wanted to seek, freedom from the oppressive Burman majority control, ended up picking up arms and trying to fight for self-determination. Corruption and militarization transformed also the country, which was once a natural, rich resource nation, into one that is probably the poorest and least developed country in the region. And it remained closed off in this isolated pariah state until most of about 2011. The Burmese junta's propaganda since the very beginning was focused really around this exclusionary idea and identity politics, really, where they promoted Buddhist Burmese nationalism. It's as a tool of not just redressing the wrongs of colonialism to try and restore Myanmar to its ancient glory, pre-colonial times, but the propaganda really focused on this. And every military campaign that the Myanmar military pursue hinged on this narrative of them as being the sole defenders of this nation, who are warding off these outsiders or elements that seek to destroy and disintegrate the state. So if I were to catalog all the outsiders or the others who, as a person from Myanmar who have been taught to fear and hate over the years, these would include the communists, the ethnic religious minorities that I mentioned earlier, and even human rights activists. Despite the regime's persistent fear-mongering campaigns, the civilian population remained ununified and steadfast in its resistance and to the military. People found moral courage, and they rose up time and time again, and they organized nationwide peaceful protests, calling for democracy. The military might, and even though many people paid with their lives and long prison sentences, that did very little to deter people from their desired goal of democracy. And yet, what is it about these latest Rohingya insurgents, whom, let's face it, when you look at the scheme of Myanmar as a whole and the same propaganda that's been used again and again, that seem to be really the latest incarnation of this ever-looming threat that the military has pushed forward? But yet, what is it about the Rohingyas that struck a chord with the population? You're seeing, evidence of this huge exodus and the persecutions against this community, and even communities who have stood united, who knows full well the types of abuses that the military is capable of, are yet somehow rallying behind this. So to answer that question, I want to share with you all the conditions both inside the country and outside Myanmar, which have led to the spread of hate and intolerance. So by 2011, Myanmar was undergoing drastic changes. It was emerging from its pariah state that I had mentioned. The deep entrenched problem of military dominance, extreme poverty, armed conflict still remained. But under the gloss of democratic transition, what we had was the military formed its quasi-civilian party. They also freed political prisoners. The human rights defenders and activists were taking off blacklists. People were allowed, including myself, to return to the country and work freely on things like human rights and law reform and strengthening rule of law. And the constraints on fundamental freedoms were laxed for the first time since 1962. Journalists and civil society had more space to talk about things. People could gather. Politics was not something that you whisper to each other with the constant fear of special branch being on you. It was something that was being done. And because of these changes and transition, diplomatic ties were restored with many countries, including the United States. And markets were opening up, and there were resources flowing into Myanmar. And it was around this time that this narrative about the Rohingya and the threat that they posed began to emerge. While people like myself use the term Rohingya freely, and I see it as a legitimate claim for an ethnic minority, which connotates a specific Muslim community in northern Rakhine, which is the state that borders Bangladesh, you need to understand that the term is a contentious one in Burma. The Burmese military and ultranationalists refused to acknowledge it. They referred to Rohingyas as Bengalis in an attempt to portray them as foreign interlopers with a separatist agenda. These tensions and distrust against the Rohingyas could really be traced back to post-World War II era or the early days of Myanmar independence, when you had members of the Rohingya community appealing to Pakistan, of what at the time includes current-day Bangladesh, of annexing their territory. And when Pakistan did not do so, certain members of the Rohingya community took up arms and fought a separatist rebellion, which lasted in some form or another until about the 1960s. And in retaliation for that, the successive military regimes eroded away the Rohingyas' rights until a community that had once enjoyed equal rights and citizenship status were deemed stateless under the Citizenship Act, which I mentioned earlier, where of the 35 groups, they were not recognized as one of them. And the Rohingyas were deprived of basic freedoms, including the freedom of movement, confined to the Rakhine state only, which is one of the poorest states in an already poor nation, sharing limited resource with yet another oppressed group, which is the Buddhist Rakhine. And these two communities, they eked out an existence until violence flared up again in 2012. An incident involving a Rakhine Buddhist woman who was raped and killed by 3 Rohingya men plunged these two communities into waves of communal violence, with both communities taking part, and it left hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas and Rakhine homeless and placed in IDP camps. The communal riots of 2012 were then coupled with this long history of the Rohingyas seeking self-determination and also separate state. These were really used, these two stories and narratives were used to sow fear about the Rohingyas. By this time, it wasn't just the military groups pushing it, though. Something new had emerged, unlike the previous era. Groups like Mabata, which stands for Race and Religion Protection Committee, supported by military, also to a certain degree by the quasi-civilian government, led by people like monks, such as Yee Htun, who took advantage of this opening up of the space to go take advantage of it, moving through the country, doing these really anti-immigration, anti-Muslim sermons and spewing hate. And ultranationalists also took advantage of a change that took place because of the opening up, and that was the liberalization of the telecom industry. Early 2000, Myanmar was the least connected country in the world, behind North Korea, Cuba. And then today, we've got 93% of the population have 3G mobile network connections, and more than 86% of the household in Myanmar have smartphones. People leapfrogged and joined the sort of social media revolution that was taking place. They joined Facebook and Viber and all the platforms with religious zeal almost. And a really recent study that I looked at showed that 38% of Facebook users, that was their main source of news. for anyone who's been to Myanmar or has worked on this area, in Burma, the idea of internet doesn't exist. It's just Facebook. And ultranationalists have utilized this platform and that space to spread out sort of these false propaganda, fear-mongering tactics, and continue this sort of atmosphere creating to fear. And another thing was working with civil society in the country. I've discovered that a lot of the time, the Russian military had actually trained Burmese military to set up these troll camps where around the clock, the military servicemen are hacking and putting out these messages, creating this atmosphere. So because of all that, you know, I'm running out of time, so perhaps we can leave it in questionings. But really, that has sort of set the stage to create this atmosphere. And a lot of the people in the community or even the international community are wondering, why is it that Suu Kyi and her party, the civilian party, at a time when the democratization is opening up, why aren't they speaking out? Why won't they stand up for these things? I want to paint this picture because these are what's at stake. For the new civilian government to act, first of all, there are serious structural barriers in place. They do not have oversight, even though they won landslide elections. They do not have oversight over key ministries that could resolve the Rohingya crisis. They also are, the way that the Constitution is set up so that is that the commander-in-chief ultimately is who decides military campaigns. So even if the civilian government wanted to intervene or direct, they have under the law, zero power to do that. And any changes to this Constitution can't be done without involving the military, which under the Constitution have been allotted 25% of the parliament in both upper and lower houses. So that's sort of the political climate that it's created in. But that leads me to this summary of why exactly populist sentiments and how dangerous it is and how it could really lead to stalling democracy and human rights. So the hope really lies in how do we then work as an international community to re-engage, support civil society actors, many of whom are in the country resisting and working against it. I ran out of time, so I'm happy to answer more questions about this or interact with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Yee. Richard?
I fear I might get a stiff neck if I do that. Can I stand there? Is it possible? Do you have a microphone? Yeah, sorry, I meant the... Hello? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'll just try to keep it within 15 minutes very quickly. It's kind of overview of my also latest book. So what I'll try to do here is to take a look at the case of the Philippines and put it within a broader context. I mean, first of all, thank you very much to Harvard Law School for the kind invitation. Although how I wish climate change didn't mean such a cold winter. I would also want to say that every time I talk here in the United States about Duterte, I tend to joke that it seems the tree doesn't fall too far from the leaf. Because as you remember, the Philippines was a colony of the US, and yet sometimes what happens here in the US very much reminds me of what happens back home. I'll try to put Duterte within a broader context of what's happening in the ASEAN and the Asian region, because I know Aung San Suu Kyi used to be the most famous person, but nowadays it seems Duterte is at the forefront of the headlines for all the wrong reasons. So these are the 4 things I'm going to discuss today very quickly within the next 10 to 15 minutes. I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to analysis of people like Duterte is that there's too much focus on his psychoanalytic profile, which kind of reminds me of the book The Young Stalin. I think the recent book by Stephen Kotkin on Stalin is a better way of approaching and trying to understand why populists come into power and what are the implications of that. And you cannot do that unless you look at what we can call the long-term structural shifts that allow for these populists to come into positions of power. I think Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist thinker in early 20th century, was correct when he said that one of the biggest problems with historians and social scientists is that they treat, for instance, the emergence of outside-the-box candidates like Mussolini, or in the case of Hitler, for instance, in Germany, as some sort of an historical freak accident. Like, these things were not supposed to happen. It's a freak accident. Therefore, let's just And a similar thing is happening here in the US, perhaps. Everyone's saying, well, Trump would not have won if not for the Russians. So I feel this is a kind of a mistake that a lot of people do, especially in the case of the Philippines, whereby the opposition, I think, is still in the stage of denial, saying that, Duterte won because he manipulated people, so on and so forth. But what you have to actually look at is the organic factors, structural long-term factors that allow for these people to come into positions of power. My number one contention in my work, and my next book is actually going to be a comparative analysis of Turkey, India, Philippines, and Indonesia, is that populism in emerging market democracies has a different dynamic to it than populism in the developed world. If you look at it in the developed world, immigration and economic stagnation are major issues that drive populism. Even in the more prosperous regions of Europe, like Netherlands and Nordic states, even though the economy has been doing well, still populism is strong. So immigration is a huge issue next to economic stagnation. But that's not the case in countries like the Philippines, whereby economic growth has been extremely robust in the past few years. And if anything, if you look at countries like India or Philippines or Turkey, these are countries not known for having anti-immigrant sentiment. If anything, they are one of the largest sources of emigration across the world. So I think this is a very important structural condition that we have to understand that distinguishes populism in the developed world from the developing world. I think Samuel Huntington's work, 1968, I don't like his latest books, Clash of Civilization, among others, but I think his first books were good because he talks about a very important dynamic in post-colonial societies, what you can call the aspirational institutionalization gap. So it's kind of like a Malthusian trap. So what happens when the economy is growing fast and doing well, aspirations of people actually increases exponentially. So does social mobilization. But in the meantime, the ability of state institutions to respond to new demands for having political voice, to new demands for public services only increases arithmetically. And that creates a gap which causes what you can call grievance politics. And that's precisely where populists come into the picture. And I think if you look at a lot of these emerging market democracies, there's some sort of a twisted form of Polanyi's double movement going on. And what's also emerging there is what you can call a strongman syndrome. There's this search for certainty in single-minded decisive leaders. And these kind of theoretical discussions are actually backed up by data. So in a Journal of Democracy article that came out in early 2017, it shows that countries like the Philippines, Georgia, India, even Turkey, majority of the population prefer a strong leader who does not have to bother with elections. So this is kind of like a demand side of populism that we have to keep in mind. In September, the Pew survey came up with a research which showed that in India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, 50% either simple majority or a majority of the population actually prefer, strong leaders, again, who do not bother with checks and balances. So it seems the structural conditions for the rise of populists has been there in the countries whereby you can say what they're going through is a trouble in paradise. So a very simple case in the Philippines. In fact, the last 6-7 years in the Philippines have been the best time in the Philippines as far as gross economic growth is concerned, 6.26%. But the problem is, as the growth picked up, expectation of people for a better future actually also expanded. The reality on the ground was that growth was extremely concentrated. So the World Bank came up with the data in 2030 that showed that 40 families in the Philippines took home 76% of that 6.25% that we talk about. So 4.5% of the entire growth of the Philippines was concentrated in 0.0001% of the population. And if you look at the Philippine political institutions, it's just as oligarchic. So even compared to Latin America, which I feel the Philippines is more comparable to than many Asian countries, the level of concentration of power is mind-boggling. So when they look at the legislative positions occupied by so-called political dynasties, connected by second degree of consanguinity, in the Philippines, the number was 70% in the Congress. Compared to Mexico, Mexico is 40%. Argentina is around 10%. Now, when they took into consideration the mistresses and outside the wedlock kids of the political dynasties, the number jumped up close to 90%. So in many ways, the last elections in 2016 was a protest vote because it was not only Duterte who won. In fact, the vice presidency almost went to Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the former dictator. It's just like imagining the Islamic Republic of Iran perhaps voting for the son of former Shah. That's what happened. So in many ways, it was a protest vote elections. And the protest vote was exactly the response to the grievance politics of the Malthusian trap in emerging markets that I was been talking about. Very quickly about Duterte, there's a lot of discussion about what is populism. Of course, one thing that makes them populist is the style, so the bad manners. That's where they project authenticity. It's also how they mobilize as a form of strategy using their populism by essentially talking about crisis. The country is going to go to apocalypse. If you don't vote for me, the country will go to hell. And of course, there's also the factor of othering, right? That it's us against a specific other. And in the case of Duterte, the others were first drug dwellers, drug suspects. And later on, the kind of definition of the other keeps on expanding. It now includes liberal thinkers, perhaps even truly yours. But one of the biggest debates in the Philippines is that does Duterte fall within the definition of fascism? There's a big debate about that issue, whether he's a proto-fascist and all. Randy David, a Filipino sociologist, kind of implies that. But if you look at other definitions by people like Neil Ferguson, among others, Duterte cannot fall under that. Nonetheless, I suggest the work Your Fascism by Umberto Eco, whereby he identifies 14 indicators of fascism, including attack on Enlightenment values, celebration of violence, among so on and so forth. And I think Duterte kind of fits some of those attributes, at least nonetheless. Nonetheless, if you look at Duterte, he is kind of what you can call an inclusive populist. He's not the first populist in the Philippine history. There was a populist called Erap Estrada, who was the Filipino president from late 1990s to 2001, and he was deposed in a civilian back coup, which we euphemistically call People Power Revolution. But there was a big difference. Similar to Thaksin of Thailand, the base of Erap Estrada was actually the poor. Now, in Estrada's case, it was the urban poor, which is around 55% of the electorate. But in the case of Duterte, actually, his strongest base is the ABC class, the upper classes in the Philippines. And we know in surveys, the A and B in the Philippines are in gated communities. You cannot go there. So it's really the C that votes for ABC, and the C are the aspirational middle class. His charisma is a combination of folksy persona, informality, anti-elitist rhetoric, among others, and bad manners, which is known for. But he also has very clear strongman tendencies. So if you look at the 4 indicators of authoritarian behavior that Levitsky and Ziblatt put forward in the latest book, How Democracies Die, kind of Duterte checks all of those 4 indicators. Rejection or conditional commitment to democratic rules, where Duterte keeps on threatening about shutting down the Congress. Denial of legitimacy of political opponents. He calls his opponents as drug lords, oligarchs, yellows, traitors, Western stooges. Toleration or encouragement of violence. He said he will fatten the fish in Pasig River with dead bodies. Well, bodies are piling up. And lastly, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opposition elements. You already see that happening with tax evasion, threats against different liberal institutions. But the key strength that Duterte has, and this is where there's a high level of tolerance, even for potential corruption or abuse of power under Duterte, is people always say, iba siya, he's different. Maybe he could be corrupt like others, maybe he violates the Constitution, but at least he's doing something. There's this kind of cult of action or celebration of action and decisiveness that is happening in the case of the Philippines. And Duterte always tried to say whatever problem happens in the country is either a fake news, a conspiracy theory by the opposition, or I'm trying to just fix the problems that I inherited from the previous administration. And that kind of logic still helps because the guy has an 80% approval rating. Nonetheless, what's happened in the Philippines is actually, in my opinion, part of a broader arc of populism. If you look at the case of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in the case of Turkey, that will be discussed later on more, or Narendra Modi or Joko Widodo, most of these guys actually come from local government backgrounds, similar to Duterte. And if Duterte said, once I become president, I'll create the so-called Davao model, similar to Narendra Modi, he talked about the Gujarat model. In the case of Widodo, he talked about his experience as Jakarta governor and the Solo mayor. And of course, if you look at all of these kind of populists, their base of support is the aspirational middle class in their country, right? The rising Hindu nationalist middle class in India, the Anatolian Tigers in the case of Turkey, and of course the middle class youth in the case of Indonesia, and it's quite similar in the case of Duterte. Now, what is the art of populist governance? Once people like Duterte are in power, people like Muller, they contend that these are the 3 things that are going to happen, and I think increasingly they're happening. First, domination of state institutions with loyal allies, purge of independent elements. The Philippine Chief Justice right now is being pushed out of position of power based on what many see as dubious cases. One of the Philippines' ombudsman office is also under attack because she opened up investigations against the president's secret bank accounts. Senator Leila de Lima, who was behind investigations against the president for alleged extrajudicial killings, guess where she is? She's now in jail. So independent elements are being slowly purged as far as the Philippines is concerned. The second is large-scale patronage politics and corruption to expand political base. Again, we see a lot of that happening in the Philippines. In fact, one of our biggest concerns are the Chinese investment in the Philippines and how there could be huge corruption scandals involved in that. And lastly, gradual and systematic silencing, intimidation, elimination of voices of extra-state opposition and independence. And Rappler, ABS-CBN, Inquirer, all the leading liberal newspapers in the Philippines are now threatened with tax evasion cases, other forms of Putinesque intimidation tactics. Now, what concerns me is that what's happening in the Philippines is not just about Philippines. It is having an effect across the region. Over the past 2 years, I have visited most ASEAN countries trying to explain what's happening in the Philippines, and what I see increasingly is a Duterte effect. So I remember going to Vietnam a few months after Duterte won, and on the front page of a Vietnamese newspaper, I saw drug bust, cracking down on drug lords, things like that, which is something I didn't know that the Vietnamese really cared about that much in the past. And Pepinski, the Cornell political scientist, talks about the voting against disorder phenomenon. And we see this kind of Duterte kind of right-wing populism now spreading across the region. No less than President Jokowi. He's known kind of like the Obama of Asia, quite a liberal, progressive guy. A few months ago, he talked in very Duterte-esque manner, saying that when it comes to the drug dealers, shoot them because we indeed are in a narcotics emergency position now, as if we're in Mexico or in some Latin American countries. Then, of course, you have the broader concern about specter of people like former general and alleged human rights violator Prabowo making a second run for presidency and perhaps doing better. And if you notice, after Duterte tried to lash out at the West, question human rights values as an important kind of Western imposed values, you saw that across the region there has been more aggressive pushback against democracy. In the case of Najib Razak in Malaysia, for instance, a few months after Duterte lashed out at Obama in the US, he questioned the Justice Department's investigation of the 1MDB corruption scandal. A few months later, in a country like Cambodia, Hun Sen went altogether eliminating all sorts of opposition and creating the latest single-party rule, and so on and so forth. And of course, the most egregious situation is right now in the case of Myanmar. So under Duterte, we see this kind of resurgence of Asian values 2.0. If you remember the 80s and 90s, two Asian leaders, Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir, used to make this argument that, us in Asian countries, we value community, the state and society cannot be separated, individualism, human rights, democracy, these are Western constructs, they do not apply to us. Well, the difference back then was these guys were making those cases in quite an articulate, eloquent way. As far as Duterte is concerned, he's making that with causes and all sorts of different colorful language. And in fact, if you see that, we're seeing the return of Asian values, in fact, in a much more gory and violent way. And this is something that really concerns me. It's shocking to go around the Philippines and people questioning whether human rights or democracy is something for us. And the broader impact we see in the Philippines is the emergence of what Farid Zakaria called an illiberal democracy. Democracy is still there. Duterte is quite a popular guy. I think any moment, if there's an election, he and his party can win that. But as far as respect for basic civil liberties, as far as constitutionalism is concerned in the Philippines, I think liberalism is actually out of the window, and we're moving towards a much more Putin-style kind of crackdown on free liberal media, among other things. Nonetheless, what is the real concern in the Philippines? I think President Duterte was onto something when he talked about concerns with law and order. We do have one of the highest rates of homicide in the world, similar to the United States. Compared to a lot of Asian countries, the availability of drugs is quite higher, particularly crystal methamphetamine, shabu, which comes from no less than China, Duterte's best friend. So there is a problem. But of course, Duterte is not correct to say that we are in a narco state. And Duterte is not correct to say that the way forward is to dispense with checks and balances and democracy and human rights. The way to move forward is to deal with the problem of capacity building in state institutions. So if you look at those figures, it shows the degree of crisis in the Philippine judicial system, whereby a single judge has to deal with 644 cases per year. The Philippines has one of the highest rate of pretrial detention. And the budget of the judiciary is less than 1% of the total budget of the government. In short, the Philippines has not invested in reforming and incapacitating its judicial system. And that's why you see this kind of vote against disorder in the Philippines. So if you want to fix the problem, you go back to the basics of building capacity in the Philippine state institutions. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Richard. Jamie?
Thanks to the Human Rights Program, to Dana and Emily and Jerry and my fellow panelists and Anna. It's a great pleasure to be here and to hear from everybody yesterday, and I'm looking forward to the comments that people have in this session and the rest of the panels. Turkey, which I've been asked to talk about, under the ruling Justice and Development Party, or the AKP, and its head, now President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I think provides a fascinating case study of the interaction of human rights and populism, the subject of our conference. I'll use the terms AKP and Erdogan here pretty much interchangeably. He has increasingly dominated the party. There's an interesting internal party governance story in there that I'll comment on. But for shorthand, it's easy at this point to refer to them as fairly unified. It occurred to me that because probably about half the audience members are not steeped in the populism literature, it might be helpful to note the definition of populism that I am employing. So I'm following Kasmuda and others, as many of the panelists have. Peter Hall highlighted this yesterday. So one of the sort of key quotes that he and his co-author, Cristobal Rivera use is that they consider populism a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, a pure people versus a corrupt elite. And they see the politics as properly being driven by the general will, Rousseauvian concept, held by that pure people. It's antithetical to and hostile to political pluralism, which I think is a key in Turkey, as well as some of the other cases. To be clear, this is a notion of populism that's compatible with both left and right populism, applying that label to both left and right wingers, including the Latin American regimes that we'll hear about in the next panel. Whether Turkish populism is in fact right or left wing is actually complicated, and I think those shorthands don't quite match up, but I'm happy to discuss that if people are interested in the Q&A. Both for those who know Turkey well in the audience and for those who don't, I want to preface with a clarification. I'm going to say some at least partly positive things about AKP rule, but this is a somewhat heresy among Turkey specialists these days, and there's been enough kind of internecine verbal conflict among them that I want to make quite clear that I'm as dismayed as anybody by the descent of Turkey into authoritarianism and repression in the last several years. For those who don't know Turkey, it has reached a sad and dark place since, depending on when you trace it, starting in 2010, but really accelerating in 2015, 16, and 17. Since an attempted military coup in July 2016, the government has fired or transferred hundreds of thousands of teachers, police officers, judges, members of the military, bureaucrats. Thousands are in prison. Turkey is now the largest jailer of journalists in the world. And freedom of expression and thought are really at a low ebb since at least the early 1980s following a brutal military coup. I do not think that these dynamics are in any way justified or necessary or even really caused by any of the positive effects of AKP rule. So nothing I say should be taken to soften that judgment. On a more analytic note, there's been a lot of debate among Turkey specialists about whether the AKP's autocratic tendencies were sort of baked into it from the very beginning. Erdogan in particular has sort of always been an authoritarian. There is less discussion of what I think is an alternative hypothesis that is fairly plausible, which is that 15 years of rule have changed both the dynamics within the AKP, this is pretty indisputable, and perhaps changed Erdogan himself some. So I'm fairly agnostic about these two possibilities. I think it's an important question. I just don't know what the answer is on it. I want to make 4 points about the relationships between the AKP's and Erdogan's populism on the one hand and human rights in Turkey on the other. I've got a couple of things to say on my fellow panelists, but I can hold that for the formal commentating section of this. So the first point I want to make, and the most important one, is that the case exemplifies 2 strands in many theories of populism. One is that populism can have a positive effect on human rights and democracy by incorporating and empowering previously disempowered groups. And the second is that it can have the negative effect of promoting a majoritarian view of democracy and thus subordinating political minorities. In Turkey, this has less of an ethnic flavor than in some other places. There is a wrinkle to that, an important wrinkle, but one that I think is worth holding for Q&A if people want to get to that. That's, of course, the Kurds. This is all about the horizontal distribution of power within the citizenry, not between the ruling elite and and its constituents. That will be my second point. So to summarize for those who haven't read my paper or know Turkey, essentially, since the AKP took power in 2002, it's progressively adopted a series of constitutional and other structural reforms that have more or less monotonically increased majority power. This has meant empowering Turks, the roughly majority of Turks who live outside the major metropolitan areas and or are working class or poor. This is not a super precise definition of what is sometimes referred to without, as I understand it, an offensive connotation at this point as black Turks, historically excluded from power. They also tend to be religiously conservative. That's the other important axis of their policy preferences. So historically, this group of black Turks have been subordinated by a Kemalist elite based in the major cities that has controlled the bureaucracy, the military, the judiciary, and really dominated party politics. The AKP since 2002 has really served as a voice of this historically excluded group. It had some of the reforms that it's instituted in policy terms have rolled back discrimination against more religious Turks. This has been most visible in the elimination of both informal norms and formal rules that have excluded women who wear headscarves from public education and a wide range of employment, as well as other areas of public life. But that's both important in and of itself to many women, religious women and men, and at this point to many non-religious secular Turks who see this as a positive development promoting inclusion of a wider range of the population. So that's been important, but it also stands for other less visible examples. One that was cited to me in Turkey was that in the past, army recruits or soldiers of any rank whose knees were dirty were sometimes punished because this was evidence that they had been kneeling to pray any number of times a day. So the inclusion, these reforms to include more religious Turks in public life, have been one of the examples. This government has also expanded government services to serve more low-income Turks and spread opportunities for economic participation, particularly through government contracts to the Anatolian Tigers, medium-sized and some smaller enterprises located outside of the big three major urban centers, Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, where economic development and government assistance has been traditionally focused. The result of these reforms has essentially been to expand democracy and political space, including freedom of religion and expression. That expansion was true up through roughly the late 2000s. In recent years, however, as the AKP has gained confidence and the opposition has been continually weak since 2002, the balance between majority empowerment and minority disempowerment has kind of reached an inflection point. The metaphor is not perfect because there's no clear point at which this occurs. But the shutting down of political space and political opposition that I referred to at the very beginning began a number of years ago and has now reached the point where minorities are excluded far more than they should be to achieve what I think most of us would judge to be a reasonable balance of minority and majority power. So this illustrates two of those classic dynamics in relationships between populism and democracy. The second point I want to make is about the vertical distribution of power between the ruling elite, political class, and this includes and primarily is about the AKP at this point, on the one hand, and the citizenry. So this happy picture of some democratization under the AKP shouldn't mask the fact that, like many, perhaps all by definition, populist movements, the vertical distribution of power between elite politicians, populists, and their constituents is heavily weighted towards the former. Populist politicians tend to see themselves as the sole legitimate voice of the unified people. And if the unified people include any people who are not unified, who have different views, the populist leader simply defines them out of the people. That may be done in ethnic terms, it may be done in other terms, but it's a convenient device and a common one. Those people may be defined as confused, they may be defined as treacherous, but either way, they're not genuine voices. So this has occurred in Turkey as well. President Erdogan portrays himself as the sole authentic voice, and that decline of democracy within the ruling AKP party, which has occurred since 2002, but really accelerated since the late 2000s, since 2007 or so, has been really quite dramatic. At this point, it really is a one-man political party, which ironically both clashes with the original founding conception of the AKP by three founders, Bülent Arınç, Abdullah Gül, and Erdogan, who wanted the party to diverge from the historical pattern of Turkish parties, which is to be one man, and it's always been a man, although there has been one female prime minister. So they wanted the party to diverge from that, but in fact, it has over time shrunk as Erdogan has consolidated power. The third thing I want to note about Turkey and the relationship with populism and human rights is that the populist trope of an elite cabal repressing the popular majority has been used in Turkey lots, but it also is widely accepted by analysts, including myself, Turks as well, as having been true. That since Ataturk in 1923, Turkey has been governed on a model of elitism and of this Kemalist elite repressing conservative, backward popular sentiment in favor of a classic kind of Westernist modernization. So the policy level, this has involved the secularist program, concentrating development in the urban centers, and having a historically fairly progressive attitude towards women's rights. Turkish feminists point out ably that this is not full equality, but this is, at least starting in 1923, a much more progressive vision. Procedurally, this has taken the form of constitutional provisions entrenching secularism, an aggressive constitutional court that's enforced those, including by closing Islamist political parties that have received healthy democratic support, and military coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, and a kind of soft military coup in 1997, as well as an attempt by the Constitutional Court to dissolve the AKP itself in 2008. That failed by a single judge's vote. The last point I want to make here is that commentators on populism sometimes struggle with the idea that populists can maintain their anti-elitist posture once they're in power. So the AKP has been in power now for 16 years and yet has maintained this basic idea that it is fighting against this elite cabal. This has been especially easy in Turkey because of that actual deep state, again, a term that is widely accepted by analysts of Turkey as referring to the judiciary, bureaucracy, and the military. Since 2003, the Gülen network, which entrenched itself in, I want to avoid the term infiltrated, because I think that's a little too strong perhaps, entrenched itself in these institutions with the help of the AKP and as an AKP ally, but then split with the AKP in 2013. Since that point, the Gülen network has replaced the traditional Kemalists as the foil for the AKP's, as the cabal that the AKP is opposing. Let me leave it at that. I've got additional things to say, but they're not critical, and I want to move on.
Thanks very much, Jamie. And thanks to all the panelists. I'll now switch to asking you if you have comments on each other's presentations, reflections on anything that's been said today, perhaps points of commonality or points of difference that you'd really like to highlight.
I'll get us started, I guess. Yeah. No, I was really interested to hear you, Richard, talk about how, under Duterte, this constant state of crisis that the Philippines has been portrayed under, because that's exactly what has been sort of fueling the sort of atmosphere of fear in Myanmar, that it is the last bastion of Buddhism for the Burman majority, and at its door is this threat of radical Islamization taking over this country. They really, I think part of the reason is like the opening up the country, the war on terror and the international foreign policies and the sensationalist reportings adds to this sort of fear. And I also would really, I've noticed an overlap about how you mentioned about the Chinese, really, when you talk about government, and that's exactly what's happening in Myanmar, despite this alleged threat of terrorism and radical Muslims taking over Myanmar, there is a real economic interest that China has in the country and a real interest in the region of why certain policies are pursued, and yet nobody's talking about it, from the troll farms that are pushing out this message to just how strong it is in that region.
Yeah, I would want to see more of your point of view on Aung San Suu Kyi, but there's big debate on, whether she's an enabler, it's a crime of omission, or it's something more sinister. And I would love to hear more about that. And of course, the idea of the emergence of ethno-nationalism in Myanmar. I think that's a new hypothesis coming on Myanmar studies, that what we're seeing is not just any nationalism, but ethno-nationalism, like a kind of homogeneous understanding of what Myanmar is. With Jamie, I think you raised a very important point in terms of like, where did it go wrong? Where there was an original sin in the very conception of the IKP, or it went wrong somewhere along the road. And I think one thing that is important to keep in mind is perhaps you can have a two-level analysis. One was whether the kind of adults, moderates, right, Abdullah Gul, for instance, among others, did they exercise their internal party control to prevent the guy from going there? And for me, the moment that David Uglu was out, right, I felt this is it. Like totally all sorts of moderate voices are gone. And I think that was one of the indicators. So one was internal party filter, which was systematically dismantled over time. But I think it could have been avoided. The second thing is, again, this is the problem. We don't want to justify what happened with Erdogan. But if you're in position of Erdogan, whereby the economy is doing extremely well, you took the country out of crisis, and yet you're having what it seems like a conspiracy. The Constitutional Court wants to take you out. The likes in the military are trying to always think about a new kind of coup in a country where we had 4 coups, including 1 postmodern coup. And then later on, you have the Gulanis also having their alternative parallel agenda. So in a way, I mean, I'm not trying to excuse it, but I think one of the problems for us is, could we have imagined an alternative Turkey when it seems there's such a level of conspiracy against a pluralistic system? And I think this is a difficulty for a lot of Turkish analysts that I think we have to grapple with down the road. Yeah, thank you.
I think that point is very well taken, and Erdogan had plenty to be worried about, as you said, the ongoing conspiracy making. Let me just add to that one element of Erdogan's personal history. I mentioned a footnote in the paper, and Doug and I were talking about yesterday, and that is that Erdogan himself was imprisoned in the late 90s.
Welfare Party.
Ironically, for reciting a poem by the chief ideologist of the Kemalist movement. So the bad faith of this imprisonment is really obvious on the surface. And Erdogan's commented that this experience of being imprisoned had a profound effect on him. So he personally has been repressed, and that was a point where he was already quite powerful and prominent. Of course, that doesn't justify, and I know you don't mean to do that either. I think the last thing I would add on the sort of dynamics of what happened internally is that somebody who'd been active in the party said to me that from his contact with Erdogan, and this would have been into the 2010s, he sensed that Erdogan was becoming really isolated and exhausted after, at that point, 13 or 14 years of power. This is just not at all surprising. We observe this with U.S. presidents, that they increasingly rely on a smaller and smaller circle, or quickly in the current case, and that that the siege mentality is almost something natural in executive rule, even when you don't have actual coup makers at the gates.
I think I didn't respond to Yee. I mean, as Littlefinger said in Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder, right? And this is the concern I have in the Philippines. When the opposition tries to call for international sanctions, they try to talk about coups to threaten the guy, talk about how CIA could help them. My point is that's just going to help Duterte to just justify further consolidation of power. And one of the other ironic things happening in the Philippines is the more Duterte actually fails in his agenda of bringing law and order, the more he has reason, in his view, to actually declare martial law. So under Duterte, ironically, we saw a rapid deterioration in the Philippine security situation. One was the ISIS elements siege in Marawi, which was mind-bogglingly scary. And the other one was the total failure of the war on drugs in terms of actually dealing with the roots of the problem, right? And yet he's using the very excuse of his failure to justify even more concentration of power. And I think this is a very dangerous dynamic. And that's why it's very hard for the opposition to respond. Damn if you do, damn if you don't. Yeah.
And that dovetails nicely into your question about how Suu Kyi and the reaction. When you look at the figure of Suu Kyi, the divergence really becomes clear. No one, when you ask maybe 10 years ago of the symbol and the icon that she is internationally, no one has fallen that far down, so to speak, as far as reputations internationally about the handling of the Rohingya crisis. I think people have often asked me as a Burmese, like, do you think that there's a chance she can come back from this? I think as a human rights supporting lawyer and also as somebody who wants to see my country of birth thrive, I think that everything that's happened is unacceptable. She could have exercised a moral authority. She could have done more. Keeping in mind the structural barriers of the Constitution, all the different institutions that prevent her from doing it, she did not order these people to be killed or pushed out of the things. That responsibility therein lies with the military and the Commander-in-Chief Mao Line. However, on the other hand of that is the fact that the divergence is internationally, this is the perspective, but domestically, people, the ultranationalist movement, and even the military are saying that she's not extreme enough when it comes to tackling the Rohingya. You've got a real flip of that. I mean, for the most part, the civil society or even the activists inside the country, they still see her as the best hope in countering the Myanmar military as that force for it, which is why, in some ways, we talk about the sense of escalation. The international community is right. I mean, just this week, as she was attending the ASEAN meeting in Australia, a group of international human rights lawyers tried to arrest her for crimes against humanity for it. But these sort of incidents, what it does is also creates and places in this Asian value versus the international biased community who doesn't understand our experience, who are saying these things for groups that they don't really understand or our history kind of thing. So I think that's where we're at right now, that divergence. But then I feel like it's creating this sense of escalation between the two communities at a time when it really should be re-engaging. The international community needs to re-engage with the civilian government plus the civil society. They need to apply pressure on the military itself to try and cease it. Arms embargo. There are things that they can do. I just feel like we have been fixated so much on this one figure as if the project of Myanmar is about Suu Kyi and her figure. It's not. It's about democracy. And how do we get that to Myanmar?
I think we'll open up the discussion now to the room. And just to note, first of all, that the event is being recorded. So if you don't want your question to be recorded, don't ask your question. Perhaps approach the panelists afterwards.
Thank you. Wojciech Sadurski. So I would like to ask you, Yee Htun, about how Myanmar fits or engages the issue of populism with which this conference is concerned. I had a conversation with you yesterday, and you know that I have been involved in Myanmar and in constitutional reform project. Yeah. Now, for all the sins and all the weaknesses and defects of Aung San Suu Kyi, which she has displayed, especially in the light of the Rohingya crisis or Rohingya tragedy, I don't think that she can be accused with straight face of being populist, or even described as a populist. There's nothing, whether one accepts this more rhetorical Mueller-style definition of populism, with which I disagree for reasons I explained yesterday, or more oriented towards institutions, processes, and political strategies, which I believe is a better way. Under none of these sort of standards is she a populist. And certainly NLD, having all the characteristics of first democratic resistance and underground, and then a successful winner in the elections, also cannot be accused of populism. They have, I remember from my discussions both with Suu Kyi and with her top leaders of NLD, especially dealing with law, they are very much in favor, say, of strong judicial review. They hate the current constitutional court, but the constitutional court of Myanmar is a joke, and they believe that constitutional review should be transferred to the Supreme Court. They believe in strong judiciary. They have no hostility against all the sort of checks and balances and so on and so on. So obviously the fact that NLD hasn't, and Aung San Suu Kyi personally, hasn't confronted the issue of Burmese nationalism versus Karen, Kachin, Shan, and now Rohingya is maybe partly a matter of their weaknesses, of their perplexity in the face of the tragedy which sort of transcends their capacities, but not populist tendencies. So my question is, how does that fit the theme, the overarching theme of our conference?
Okay, I'll answer it then. So thank you for that question. I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment of the NLD and Suu Kyi, and this is part of the reason why the civilians and civil society inside the country and activists say she's the best hope, because for all the reasons that you listed fully. But what has happened, at least for the theme of the conference, is that this narrative of populism, this ultranationalism has permeated and trickled through different spheres, and the military and these different elements, whether it's these Mabata or different networks have messaged it. For me, I wish that the NLD, in its counter-narrative, could have stood on the principles of democracy or ran on this platform. But I think because the atmosphere, even I think they were calculating for the election, let's make those changes, let's be bold once we're in power. Perhaps those came into place. No one can understand why they did what they did in responding, but it's as if the scene has been set by these movements that are pushing these populist movements, and by being silent and by not challenging it, in some ways they are they could have used a counter narrative or to engage with that, and right now it's sort of like dancing to the tune of what has been said instead, and that's wherein lies what could have been with regards to Myanmar and Suu Kyi.
Thank you. Jeremy Waldron from NYU. I wanted to ask perhaps an unfair question to all three panelists. My understanding of what we're doing here today is not just explaining the populist threat to human rights in various contexts and various settings, but exploring the more troubling question of whether that challenge requires us to rethink anything about human rights, as though our current conception or consensus on human rights and the institutions and assumptions that support it is always going to be a work in progress. It always ought to be exposed to pressure from various outside forces. It's not God-given. It's something that we have to figure out. And so the question is whether there is anything in these accounts from Myanmar or the Philippines or Turkey that leads us to rethink anything. I mean, maybe the answer is no, and that would be an acceptable answer, but it seems to me we have to think about it. The only thing I could see in the presentations or in the papers that were circulated was in Richard's last couple of pages, where he referred to the Philippines' problem being lack of investment in the capacity of judicial institutions and the broader penal system, which seemed to me to signal that if you really want to take human rights seriously, it's not enough just to condemn Duterte. You have to look at the institutional infrastructure that supports human rights. So can we have any suggestions? I know this is primarily for the panels this afternoon, but it would be a pity if the particular country studies didn't yield any results
Yeah, who would like to start off there?
Can I go there? Yeah. Well, I mean, for a long time, the Philippines was supposed to be bastion of human rights and democracy in the region, right? We have among the best human rights lawyer. We tend to advise other countries on how to move forward. Within the ASEAN, we were the voice of the ASEAN. But I think the problem was it made us forget that on the grassroots level, people don't really understand what is human rights. And that it was quite a wake-up call when we saw that people see human rights quite, genuinely, not only trolls or fake news. They saw human rights as a shield used, due process and human rights are kind of put together, as a shield used by well-connected, corrupt people with good lawyers to avoid prosecution. And if you look at the numbers I presented there a while ago, where justice is, the wheels of justice don't even grind, they just completely stop at some point. You can understand that people will make this false causal connection that, oh, you have due process and human rights, that's why no justice happened. So why not just take it out and then justice will come? And I think that's also where you did not see massive backlash against Duterte. As far as his war on drugs is concerned, it has 8 out of 10 people's approval. Yes, people disagree with methods, they want suspects being kept alive, but I think the level of tolerance says something about the fact that we, the so-called liberals, for the lack of a better term, we have to do a better job of communicating to ordinary people, what is this human rights? How can that human rights protect you, regardless of your color, religion, gender, so on and so forth. So I think it's a wake-up call for us to know that these values, we should not take them for granted. We have to resell and re-advocate them to the society. And the second thing is you have to invest in the judicial system because the level of underinvestment just sets it up for failure. That is why now that the Philippine judiciary is under attack, under constant attack, no one is really coming to the rescue among the ordinary people, with the exception of human rights community and academics, because no one has sympathy for what they feel is a complete failed, pillar of the state system. Because justice is just so slow. I mean, we have the second highest pretrial detainees in the world. 60% of people in the jail were not even indicted, or they were not even proven to be guilty of anything. So I see where the frustration comes from, but I think the Duterte way is definitely not the way forward.
So, Jeremy, thanks for the question. I don't think Turkey presents a lot of suggestions for revision in our thinking about human rights. The one thing that I would pull out of it, maybe there are two things here, is the value for practical engagement on human rights of a little bit of philosophical stepping back. And the irony for someone like me with so little philosophical both bent and skill suggesting this to you is high. But I think that much of practical human rights activism, both by international institutions and by NGOs, focuses on a kind of institutional mapping in the democracy area. You know what I'm talking about. I think that stepping back and thinking about what we mean by democracy in a functional sense, and essentially there's an economic definition that I find very useful, which is the dispersion of political power among the citizenry in the direction of perfect equality. So perfect democracy here is perfectly equal distribution of power across the citizenry. Obviously, no existing polity beyond about 3 or 4 people is going to be able to achieve this, and that's fine. But it provides a way of thinking about democracy that evades the sort of simple majority versus minority trade-off, and instead understands that if minorities are repressed, this is a failure of democracy because the minority citizens have too little power, and if majorities are repressed, then the majority citizens have too little power. This works rather nicely for Turkey, and I think that if we had been perhaps more attentive, some of us, although there were plenty who were good on this, to this pattern in Turkey over time from 2002 onward, we would have been more attentive to the risk that the rebalancing toward majority rule would eventually reach a point of inflection and go too far the other way. So perhaps this philosophical awareness could inform the analysis and activism of the more practical people.
As far as Myanmar go with regards to the current crisis that we've covered, it's really been a sobering, reflective watershed moment for people inside Myanmar and also for the democratic diaspora or even the activists, because these are people who have long held that we are wanting democracy and human rights in Myanmar. And yet, when you're seeing in your very own backyard denial of these basic rights, and yet at the same time, the sort of the fear and the pervading narrative of protecting our sovereignty is, the same arguments that the military for so long has used is now suddenly resonating with people. And part of that is, I agree to a huge degree with the lack of institutions that can counter and check those powers in place. I think that what's unique about Myanmar versus some of these other countries such as Turkey or Philippines is the fact that it never quite emerged from that military totalitarianism. The fact that it has this gloss of democratic reforms and elections, but underneath it all, you still have very much military control over it. Which has, after more than half a century, weakened institutions such as courts, education. People have lost the ability to think critically when confronted with these things. Also, even health, basic health and trauma and healing and self-care. And I think not investing in these and just assuming that human rights and democracy would fit this neat package has not arrived. And I think this has been this reflective moment for us. Thank you.
Dinah Shelton, George Washington University. My question is a bit of a follow-up to Jeremy's, and it's about the role of the European Court of Human Rights. It has upheld the ban on Islamic parties and many of the headscarf bans in Europe. Do you think it is too deferential to the differences of states when they're leading in a populist, anti-democratic manner? Or do you think it's achieved the right balance with their margin of appreciation doctrine?
Can I punt that to Larry? Seriously, I think actually Larry would have much more interesting things to say on this,
sure,
because
go for it.
I think it's a great question. I think it speaks for itself. But I've not dug enough into the European Court's precise balances on this, with this in mind, I think, to give you a good thought. So,
would you like to comment?
Kind of coming out of the blue. So I was thinking, I was making a note, Dinah, to bring something up in my panel with Jerry this afternoon. But, the extent of the bigger question here are the way in which doctrines of deference are going to be country-specific or context-specific, and they can cut against each other. So some of the cases involving Turkey said, look, Turkey's different, right? Because it is a democracy, but it is majority Muslim. It is different from other European countries. That's where the doctrine started in Leila Shaheen, and then, of course, it changed. That sort of specificity drops out a little bit, or it becomes sort of everyone is special. So I think though that doctrine at its inception was, at least my thinking would be, that the court was trying to kind of empower secular forces in Turkey. And then it's become a wider set of considerations with respect to the dangers of Islamic terrorism in Europe in general. So to the specific answer to your question, should they shift it? I mean, maybe in the sense that, who currently, is the minority within that context may have shifted. So this is a little bit about Jamie's point about the inflection, right? So when majorities and minorities maybe flip positions, then maybe the court's doctrines need to adjust. But the bigger elephant in the room is, can you have an international human rights institution that has robust, kind of different doctrines of deference for different countries?
Elena Alviar, Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. So thank you for a really interesting panel. And I actually wanted to ask the three panelists about the economics of the narration, because populism has an economic story to it, and it was present in some of the presentations. Specifically, I was fascinated by the fact that some of these economies are really growing. So Turkey and the Philippines are growing that much. So is there not like a populist economic twist to it, or if you could say a little more about that aspect of it. Thank you.
Who would like to take that one?
I can start on that. So I was pondering this a little bit this morning and trying to think sort of what the coherent story is on Turkey here. It doesn't quite fit. It doesn't fit the U.S. and European sort of model of increased economic insecurity that then promotes the rise of a populist party. You do have repeated economic crises in the 1990s, along with kind of political incompetence and fragmentation, a lot of unstable coalition governments that are important factors in the emergence of the AKP, both as a party and then its really quite stunning electoral victory in 2002, which was the first election it contested, where it got something like 34% of the votes, but because of a combination of Turkey's extremely high barrier to political party representation in parliament, it's a 10% electoral threshold, and the fragmentation of the other parties and lack of support for them coming out of that 90s history, the AKP gets something like 67% of the seats in parliament and then is launched on its way. So the economics does matter here. But it's not quite the same story, and I think the political fragmentation and sense of elite incompetence is at least as important. Then in terms of the policies it pursues in power, this sort of goes to the definitional question of, do you define populism in economic policy terms as pursuing sort of irresponsible, popularly oriented policies, which I'm sure we'll address in your panel. I don't think that the AKP, it's a matter of degree. I mean, the AKP has been more attentive to the benefits to the wider population of its policies, but I think it's largely been somewhat responsible. There's arguments over this about AKP economic policy, but I think the continuities with previous regimes sort of exceed the differences. It's a highly statist country. The economy is largely state-driven, despite the AKP's sort of neoliberal reputation. It remains a basically state-centered economy. So I don't think it quite fits any of the classic narratives, really.
Yeah, that was exactly my point, that the dynamics of emerging market democracy completely doesn't fit with what we see in the West. We're not talking about losers of globalization. We're talking about one of the biggest sort of winners of the globalization. So two things come into picture. One is the standard distributional aspect. Do we have inclusive development? For instance, in the case of the Philippines, 6.2, 6.5% growth. But if you look at underemployment, if you look at poverty rates, barely moved. In fact, in certain regions, it got worse. And then you have the broader kind of collective psychology of ressentiment. So a lot of people who actually supported Duterte are these people who came from non-elite schools. Duterte himself comes from San Beda, which is not part of the elite three schools of Ateneo, La Salle, and UP. So there was also this feeling that the economy is growing, our incomes are getting a little bit better, there's business process outsourcing coming in, maybe I can buy a new iPhone, maybe I can buy a new car, but I know there's always a glass ceiling for people like us. We're not going to be really part of those, those bastards on the top, those elite guys. So kind of Duterte was very good in terms of tapping into that. That's why I said the base of his support is really the aspirational middle class. People who don't come from the tier 1 elite schools, but have sufficient level of economic mobility and educational kind of training, but have a feeling that they will never be accepted to the top. And kind of Duterte open up the space for these people. And I think this is something we have to keep in mind in terms of the political economy of what's happening in this country.
With regards to the economic elements of what's happening with the ultranationalism, populism in Myanmar, there's a degree in which economic policies surrounded by giants such as China and India has played a role. In some cases, with the country opening up, tremendous amount of wealth has flowed in. And feeding that after decades of being closed off is this idea of this sort of zero sum where the more you open up the resources, how much of the pie is left for us to share. Because even though the country has opened up, the land confiscation, land being the most precious resource in Myanmar, it's still being divvied up no different from the eras of the military dictatorship, in which you've got crony companies, international companies, a lot of Chinese business interests coming in and investing, but that wealth never really sees or reaches into the pocket of the disfranchised people in Myanmar. And that definitely plays into this narrative of a false zero-sum equation, more rights for the minorities. And the ironic, or I should say the tragic example of Rakhine is that prior to it being plunged in this Rohingya versus Rakhine Buddhists, both communities were actually extremely resentful of the fact that there was plans for a deep sea harbor being planned for within their region, and there was supposed to be a gas pipeline that was going to transport the oil from this deep sea port straight up from the Arabian Peninsula, cutting all the way up to China. So both communities were engulfed in this, but since these riots and the ensuing crisis happened, the concept of economics, at least in that state, has diminished to a certain degree.
Got Doug in the corner there.
Thank you. For people who enjoy Turkey, there was one wonderful set of jokes that took place in Turkey that ended with very silly questions like the elephant, pro or against Turkey. And these were really told about the embedded paranoid nationalism of the Kemalist era. So there's a very deep kind of us and them already throughout Turkish culture. So my question is this. Erdogan, I believe, had a real project to succeed getting Turkey into the European Union. And one of the important features that he had to address, but he had personal reasons for it as well, was the need to break the power of the deep state over the government. There are plenty of examples where the deep state controlled the government in the 90s. Erdogan suffers from it, and the EU really requires dismantling the National Security Council, the military control over civilian policy. So it's a good ally. And a lot of progress is made from 2002 to 2005 and 2006 toward meeting the EU objectives. But there grows the anti-Turkish element, we won't let you in over our dead bodies. And I think that had a very negative impact on Erdogan feeling abandoned, but also Turkey feeling justified in its reaction to this. So I'd like if you would comment about the effects of the international relations, the EU policy about Turkey, but it leads broadly to the question, I think, with the other members of the panel to think, what are elements where international human rights work and international relations can promote pluralism? Is it always a dead end when the international community inserts itself? Are there ways that it could have positive effects on promoting democratic values as opposed to being the whipping boy, the elephant, which is anti-Turkish?
So I don't want to say much just because I think Doug well characterizes the key questions here. I would, two small glosses. I'm not sure how much we should attribute the later closing of political space in Turkey to backlash against the EU, the EU pulling away, which I think you characterize well. And I agree with that part of what's going on here is the European sort of standoffishness towards Turkey, which has a racial religious element, no question, and that there's a disenchantment on Erdogan's part, on the part of many pro-EU Turks. Because of that, there's something of a two-way street here, that there's real pushback by the AKP and, in some cases, Kemalists' opposition to the AKP against some of the EU reforms. the other things I'd want to say is simply that I think in Turkey, to a large degree, the EU pressure that you describe has been a positive force for human rights and democratization. As you said, primarily in the early part of the AKP years, and before that, really tapering off in the last to near zero in the last number of years. And of course, the refugee deal is something we haven't addressed at all, but that's there.
Any thoughts on these broader questions?
Yeah, I think China is definitely the elephant in the room. In the case of the Philippines, I can say that Duterte would not have been so confident, to push back against ICC, exiting the country from there, to lash out at the U.S., to crack down on the human rights groups or liberal critics if he didn't feel that the Chinese will be there for him no matter what. So I think that's definitely a factor. And we have a concern as China becomes more dominant and tries to rewrite the rules of the game. And as the U.S. has this big problem called Trump, it's going to be very difficult for the international community to engage. Nonetheless, there are efforts by other countries, middle powers, whether it's Canada, Australia, Japan, and the European Union, to still engage the Duterte administration. And I think which goes back to the question on judicial reform or the issue of drugs. I told, for instance, our friends in the European Union, I visited them twice in the past 2 years, and I said, maybe instead of just attacking Duterte, help the Philippines to deal with the drug epidemic. It's not as bad as, Colombia in the 1980s or Mexico today, but still we got a problem. We have tens of thousands of people who need cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe you can help us with that. Maybe you can create rehabilitation centers, for instance, in the Philippines, or invest more in our judiciary and law enforcement agencies. New York, state of New York has more policemen than the entire Philippines, for instance. Small things like that, and you don't need to spend billions of dollars. You can only have some targeted millions of dollars there, and it could make a huge difference. And then I said, the Philippine media is very Western-leaning. Don't worry, they'll do a great job of promoting that. Because the Chinese are building huge rehabilitation centers. No one wants to cover them, except in negative way. So as I said, you have allies in the Philippines, engage with the government, but essentially beat them in their own game. Don't try to commit in this kind of a holier-than-thou kind of approach. That's not going to fly. And Filipinos, they're going to get patriotic and defend their president no matter what. He's still our SOB, no matter what kind of mindset, right? So I think there's still room, despite the unfortunate things happening called Trump, there's still a room for the so-called international community to engage.
Yeah, just to add to, at least for the context of Myanmar, is the fact that in addition to China, we've got the complication of Russia. I think I alluded in my presentation a little bit earlier just about how the close ties between the military linkages as far as training and expertise, so you've got that. And for many years ago, I was involved with a movement to try and refer the regime to the ICC, and a lot of it was reaching even to the Security Council, and it failed ultimately because of, yet again, the veto power that China and Russia possess. And yet again, now with the Rohingya crisis being what it is, the call within the international community is circling around this, and I don't know where it lies, but I hope that Myanmar is looking to its permanent allies of Russia and China to sort of protect them yet again. But this is sort of the engagement where we hope, even with the rise of populism here in the States, which for so long had been a huge ally of Myanmar. Obama was the first head of state ever to visit the country. Hillary Clinton, in her capacity of Secretary of State, was really responsible in helping negotiate. So times have definitely changed as far as relations with the U.S. Post-Trump. In fact, after Trump was elected, the people who were celebrating were virulently, at least in Myanmar, were the race and religion protection people and the monks and things like that. So I think even though these large superpowers of so-called no longer are playing a lesser role to a certain degree, at least in that country, I think I agree with Richard's assessment of how roles like the Norwegians have been in country investing in peace talks, shoring up on ethnic minority rights, trying to make sure these kind of tragedies don't happen again. We can try and talk about SSR and how do we engage to get the military to unclench itself. And identity politics doesn't need to be about exclusion and around race and religion. How do we promote multidisciplinary things of embedding that in that country? And I think the international community has a wealth of expertise, and that's something that we have to try and reach the local target audience there.
We're rapidly coming to the close of our time, unfortunately. And I'm sure everyone is eager to have their second coffee of the day. So if everyone could join me in thanking our panelists for today. Thank you to all three of you.
Thank you.